I would really like to hear about the history of Qi Dao and the lineage of Qi Dao, the history. I know there's in Qigong, there's often talked about different lineage. It's probably better that you try to explain it because I don't know not so much about it.
I can start from like the really ancient times, or would you be more interested in modern history?
No, I would actually like to hear some of the history, the background. Where does it come from? Is it Tibet? Is it from India?
All right. Well, so let's go back into ancient history first.
Yes.
Shamanism is considered the most ancient of all spiritual traditions known to humankind.
Mm-hmm.
And shamanism essentially is the tradition of practicing some spiritual practices connecting with nature, both our inner nature as well as nature at large, recognizing certain aspects of nature that would be beneficial to human beings, and emphasizing those aspects of nature so that it would improve the quality of life. So, for example, the shamans of various cultures, various nationalities, are known for performing various types of shamanic rituals or healing practices. And some of them also develop movement practices, for example, shamanic dances. Some of them are done to music, beating of a drum. Can be seen all over Siberia, and Native American shamanism has similar drum beating. Certain types of shamanism evolved in different parts of the world, more interested in inner exploration. For example, in Australia, a particular type of shamanism evolved that is concerned with dream time and with exploration of dreamlike nature of reality, and basically that's similar in many respects to the exploration of dreamlike nature of reality known in Hawaiian shamanism, called Huna, or Siberian shamanism, or Tibetan shamanism. There is a number of shamanic practices in North America that are well connected with that way of perceiving the world as a dream. For example, Hopi, or in European shamanism also. Of course, European shamanism got suppressed quite a bit. It was considered paganism and got supplanted by Christianity in many cases. But in some parts of Europe, still some of the aspects of it practiced, for example, in Lapland and Finland. And I think there is a current resurgence of both the Celtic shamanism and the Wicca, and perhaps even some Scandinavian countries also experience some resurgence of shamanism associated with pre-Christian traditions, maybe even some Viking traditions, because obviously most Vikings were not Christians either. And in Russia, there was a long-standing tradition of shamanism that eventually got kind of suppressed by the Orthodox Christian Church. But many parts of that country still practice shamanic practices, especially Siberia, which is a vast piece of land, where many native people, tribal people, still practice various types of shamanism, including a part of Siberia that is right at the center of the Asian continent, the Altai region, with high Altai mountains. And one of those mountains, Beluga, which can be translated into English as the White Mountain, is considered kind of the epicenter of a tradition that is based on the mythical or perhaps legendary Shambhala culture or the Shambhala kingdom. And of course, it can be also traced back to Tibet. So a lot of practices that are practiced in Siberia nowadays were brought to Siberia by the Mongols, who were creating the largest empire in the world in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And Russia was under the Mongol rule for 300 years. And the Mongols initially were shamans, and Mongolian shamanism is pretty close to Tibetan shamanism called Bon.
Mm.
But eventually they also, following the steps of Tibetans, got introduced to Buddhism. And so a majority of Mongols are Buddhists now. And the Tibetan Buddhism got brought to different parts of Russia, so much so that several parts of that country are still Buddhist countries. For example, to the east and south of Baikal Lake, there is an area called Buryatia. That's a hotbed of Tibetan Buddhism in Russia. There is another part of Russia around the Altai Mountains called Tuva, which is also very much a Buddhist country, where Buddhism is actually mixed still with the local shamanic practices, similar to the way that Tibetan Buddhism is mixed with Bon in many respects. That is what makes Tibetan Buddhism a unique form of Buddhism. There is also another part of Russia, actually in Europe, that is also a traditional Buddhist country called Kalmykia, just northwest of the Caspian Sea. And so it's a really interesting kind of a coexistence of Buddhism and shamanism that developed eventually into what I experienced and practiced for most of my life. And one of the things about this intermixing of Buddhism and Bon that developed into an energy practice associated with both a practice of connecting with the inner nature, with Buddha nature, as they would call it in Buddhism, or the energy, which is essentially the inner nature of everything in our world. And so it became an energy practice initially called True Hor. And because of the influences that Tibetan culture received from both the Chinese side of the continent and Indian side of the continent, there are kind of also interesting mixtures of Indian and Chinese practices that eventually developed into something unique in Tibet, similar to Indochina. As name implies, Indochina is also between India and China, and it includes some of the aspects of both of those cultures. So both in Indochina and in Tibet, some of the tantric practices became more prevalent in the context of Buddhist studies or energy arts. Then they also evolved into what we call Tibetan shamanic Qigong. Mm-hmm. Tibetan shamanic Qigong obviously is associated with Tibetan Buddhism, but also with Tibetan shamanism, Bon tradition I was just mentioning. It's like a shamanism that is organized. Like in Japan, for example, there is a Shinto. Mm-hmm. In Korea, there is also kind of a more organized shamanic practice. There are actually two distinct types of shamanism in Korea. Maybe because of South and North Korea, maybe because some Korean shamans, they inherit lineages, versus there are some others that kind of get an inspiration or some sort of a call to become a shaman. And so they have slightly different styles. And in China, Taoism as an organized form of Chinese shamanism. Mm. In many respects, at least, it's a very shamanic spiritual path. And so Taoist thought is also influential in the context of the Chinese influences on Tibetan culture. Mm-hmm. So a lot of ideas from Taoism in terms of the Tao being, the way of things, Qi being the flow of energy flowing through everything in the universe, the ideas of yin and yang also are somewhat prevalent in our practice of Qigong and Qi Dao in particular.
Mm-hmm. And for example, for Qi Dao or into your lineage, what is the value, the foundation or core value?
There are different branches of energy practices. This is the tree representing the historical development of Qigong. From the original shamanic roots, certain branches started developing at different times. At a certain time, about 2,500 years ago, when Confucius as well as Lao Tzu lived more or less at the same time in China, they developed their respective schools of thought, Confucianism and Taoism, respectively. And so some people who followed the ways of Confucianism developed the energy practices dedicated to attainment of primary objectives or the values of Confucianism. And what are the values of Confucianism? Well, harmony in family, harmony in society, achieving certain success in life, and developing greater betterment of each individual. The Taoists, on the other hand, they were kind of renegades. So they basically were not interested in improving society so much. Often they would retreat into the mountains, live in the caves, or build a temple somewhere in the wilderness. And they were pursuing different set of goals or different values, such as connecting with nature, learning how to flow with the cycles of nature and with the flow of things, the Tao. And being in harmony with the Tao would purportedly allow them to experience immortality, or at least great longevity and wellness in their daily lives. About the same time, 2,500 years ago, Buddha Shakyamuni lived in India, and he developed a school of thought called Buddhism. So his followers created schools of energy arts dedicated to the pursuit of what Buddhism is about: attainment of enlightenment or nirvana, the state of freedom from suffering, or spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening is also of high interest to tantrics. So Tantra is a spiritual tradition that came also from India. And people who practice Tantra also pursue enlightenment or creating mutually empowering and enlightening relationships and developing energetic awareness of the inner essence. There is also a couple of more secular branches of Qigong developing along the way of healing practices. So those are called medical or therapeutic Qigong. And obviously their objectives are health and healing, and also martial arts Qigong. And obviously that is dedicated to protect oneself or protect others. And so different objectives basically pull people in different directions. Some people do the Qigong that looks completely different from another type of Qigong. And obviously those people who practice a specific style of Qigong, they only get to experience a particular flavor of that art. I mean, some schools or some practitioners combine maybe martial arts with maybe therapeutic practices. Or maybe some Taoists become practitioners of Chinese medicine, and they also combine medical Qigong with Taoist Qigong. Of course, it also can happen among Buddhists. For example, in Shaolin Temple in China, developed a tradition of practicing Buddhist meditation, similar to Zen. They call it Chan in Chinese, combined with practice of martial arts, or wushu. So in other words, there are some schools that combine more than one of these branches. As far as I know, Qi Dao is the only school that actually integrates them all by just going to reach for the fruits on the branches of the tree, but actually going to the roots of the origins of the energy arts itself. And what are the origins of the energy arts? Well, they come from shamanic culture. Spiritual traditions I just mentioned, be it Buddhism or Taoism or others, Confucianism, Tantra, they are no older than 2,500 years ago because the founders of those traditions lived back then. We know that these energy arts, nowadays called Qigong, obviously it's a more modern term, but the energy arts had been practiced for thousands of years before that. Some of the history of this traditions go back 5,000 or even 6,000 years ago. So what did they practice? They didn't practice Buddhist Qigong. They didn't practice Taoist Qigong. They didn't do any Confucianism because it was way before Confucius lived. They were practicing shamanic Qigong. Well, in other words, shamanism is the core foundation of these energy arts. And if we understand how to connect with the essence of these arts, then the results that we would be seeking by following particular branch would become available too. And we can become very healthy and experience longevity as a result of practicing the principles of the energy arts, the core essence of the arts. So the Taoists would be envious. Can we heal? Absolutely, we can experience healing. That's what most shamanic practices are known for, that they have some healing capacity. They also can be applied, for example, for self-defense. Not only spiritual self-defense, like creating certain energy field around you, or perhaps warding off some evil spirits, but actual physical self-defense. Somebody is trying to kick your ass, we can actually show them who's the boss. So in other words, there are all kinds of applications of the principles. But if we focus on the inner essence, then these applications become natural and almost spontaneous. As opposed to focusing on the forms, what most styles of Qigong tend to do. And by definition, focus means ability to pay attention to one thing at a time. So if you're focusing on the forms, you actually are not focusing on the inner essence. What we do is we move our focus of attention to the inner essence, so we don't concern ourselves with forms so much. I don't want to say that forms are bad and should be neglected or just got rid of. We would be tossing the baby with the bathwater. But we don't study forms. We basically discover how some forms become like poetry. You need to learn language first before you start writing or reciting poetry. If you just learn a poem in a foreign language that you don't know, you may recite it. You may even sing it. You may even dance to it. But it's not going to make you fluent in that language.
No. I have actually a question about the words, because, for example, Qi Dao, how would you describe that? Is that connected with shamanism, Qi Dao? Because, for example, Taoism is similar to the words, which is just like to really understand Qi Dao. If you could explain.
Well, as you suggested, that the name Qi Dao has something to do with Tao. Now, is Tao unique to Taoism? But isn't really unique to Taoism. It's a very universal term that is also used by Confucianists and Buddhists in China and other parts of Asia. In other words, the Tao is a flow of things. Basically, that's the way to refer to the universe. Of course, I was also mentioning Taoism a couple of minutes ago as a more organized form of Chinese shamanism.
Yes.
Now, why do we call our Qi Dao these days? Well, for two reasons. For one simple reason, when I came to America, I didn't want to use the term true whore because it doesn't sound good to most English-speaking ears. They're like, what are you teaching us exactly? And so what would I call it? Well, I call it Qi Dao. This is actually the term that probably initially started being used relatively recently, maybe 100 years ago, by one of my great uncles that was involved in the Civil War in Russia after the Russian Revolution in 1917. And they basically were kind of fighting against the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks eventually won and pushed all the White Guard, or the White Army, as they called them, further and further east to Siberia, eventually to Manchuria. And Manchuria ended up being the place where a lot of folks who were not Bolsheviks ended up settling down. Millions of Russians ended up living in Manchuria. Many of them settled around the city of Harbin, which is a pretty large city in that area, but also elsewhere, until the Japanese took over Manchuria in 1933, and they created the Manchukuo, basically like a Japanese colony. Russian was widely spoken, or at least there were a lot of people who were like Russian immigrants. And apparently that is the time, or maybe even before that it happened, but I just don't know about it, when our practices that were practiced in our lineage also started getting a Chinese name. So Qi Dao is a Chinese or Mandarin name, and Qi means energy. And Dao means the path or the flow of things. So basically, it's the flow of energy that we study. That's why I also refer to it as the art of being in a flow.
Yes.
Which in a sense is the holy grail of all Qigong practices. That's what all Qigong practitioners would love to experience. They would love to be in the flow and stop struggling against the flow of Qi, or the flow of things. It's just simply, it's hard to do that if you're doing forms.
Yes. Yes, I have.
When you do a more spontaneous practice like we do.
Yes, I have practiced medical Qigong. Then practicing Qi Dao, I really explored that my mind actually became a lot more open, because I was actually testing different principles, which actually also made me find out what I resonated with more than others. You know, there's like the tree. And if, for example, if you are only being introduced to one branch of the tree, this is what you do. But if you're introduced to everyone, you can actually find out what you resonate with the most, or maybe which quality in your own nature that you actually that has kind of resonance with the branches. So that was what I have found out. That was quite interesting, so that I, for myself, could find out what my inner nature actually resonated the most with, but also could explore the different branches. That was a really interesting journey.
Marvelous. I think you're absolutely right about testing. That's one of the things that are not widely used in other styles of Qigong for some reason. I think because if people start testing things, they won't be doing what they're being taught to do. If you're being taught to do certain forms and you start testing and finding out what works for you, you will not be indoctrinated in this particular school or lineage very well. And that kind of indoctrination is very predominant in Chinese culture. Authenticity, on the other hand, is not really respected as a high value, as far as I understand, in Chinese culture and perhaps other Asian cultures like that. That's simply leads to, sticking with the certain teachings that you've been taught or certain techniques that you've been given, and that's what you know and that's what you do.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are some renegades who actually break the rules and start doing things that they're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
What do? They discover that something else works better for them than what their master taught them.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? They may actually create some new form or some new technique. And then they start teaching it to others. Those people become known as masters. In other words, who do we call a Qigong master? By and large, it's the person who either created a new style, a new form, a new school of Qigong. But if you think about it, how they became masters, pretty much each and every one of them violated the rule that they're supposed to do what the master told them. Instead, they actually created something different, something that worked better for them, obviously, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing that new thing. They would just stick with the old one. And that's what made them masterful. And mastery in this case is the ability to do things with relative ease that most other people find difficult. And that's something that is never taught. Nobody teaches how to become a Qigong master. Because in a sense, it's violating the rules that everyone is supposed to follow.
Yeah.
I guess I'm that kind of renegade that actually teaches how to become a master in your own right. You don't have to create a new style necessarily, because you can actually master the art of testing and master the awareness of the principles and maybe discover something new. That's why Qi Dao masters don't have to create a new Qi Dao school. They just simply become masters as a result of discovering something that worked particularly well for them. So some of them may feel like martial arts practice is what they resonated most with. Like my grandfather was one of the top martial arts masters in the former Soviet Union. For example, others may discover that they resonate more with the healing practices and become masters in their own right. And so basically every lineage holder or every Qi Dao master has their own predilection. They, like, for example, why did I take the name Tantrapa? I found Tantric Qigong was something that I particularly resonated with, even though, of course, I also study and practice all other aspects, but simply that was my resonance that I found. And other people obviously have their own. And so what we do is we promote this kind of authenticity, and we empower each practitioner, each individual to discover what really works for them, what they value the most, and empower them to satisfy their values or uphold them so that they would feel like they're actually living their true values. Most people who live their true values experience much greater quality of life than those who don't.
Yes. I also think that to be in the flow, you actually have to be, using your creativity. To foreign forms, it is maybe not so much creative. So to be in the flow or the Tao, I think to actually be able to perceive the flow, you will need to be open for the flow and move with the flow. And that I think needs not to be in a solid way of being that, but that you do open and creative and curious. So, yeah. So,
and also evolving. What you discovered at some point through practice, through testing, through experimenting, also doesn't become a stale art. It needs to be a living art. That's why I always talk about Qi Dao being a living art, because we don't put it into a box. Even when we found something that's really working well, something that really improved our quality of life, we don't get stuck with that. We continue evolving because we keep growing, we keep expanding our consciousness, we keep discovering new things. That means our art doesn't become stale and rigid, doesn't die, which is unfortunately what doing forms often leads to. That's why people have to create new forms, because it would be kind of difficult to just say, my form is always evolving and always changing. Well, that's not really a form then. It's a free flow thing.
Yes.
And what we do is we basically do the free flow thing fully consciously. We accept that this is how practice needs to be done,
Yes.
instead of doing the regimented forms. It's like, imagine somebody, let's say, is a painter. You can follow somebody else's strokes and you can paint perfectly just like another master painter. But that is not going to make you a master painter.
No.
It's just going to make you a really good copier.
Yeah. Yes. Well, for me, I think I actually use it in my everyday life also. For example, just by baking bread. Sometimes when I bake bread, it becomes a really, really good bread. So many people say it's a good recipe, but when I want to bake again, I will need to do the recipe different. I never do the same recipe. I have to change it a bit. So in some kind, it's always a little different, but maybe the base and the sense of it is the same, but I have to do it with some kind of flow, how to do it today, what to put it in it today, because otherwise it's simply too boring to bake the same after the same recipe. So there have to be something new. I have to be like something that invoke my curiosity, or what do I resonate with today? Let's try see what it creates out of it. So in that form, I actually like the way of being in the flow with the different things that we do, but still have a kind of touch from what we are doing.
Well, what you just said was really important. And you actually revealed one of the key principles of intelligent decision making. You said that you sensed what you resonated with. Well, that's exactly what we begin to use, replacing the old, stagnant, or outmoded way of decision making that most people are familiar with. Most people are familiar with the idea of good and bad decisions, or good and bad course of action, or good and bad ingredients, or good and bad recipe, or formula, or anything. And basically, they no longer sense the energy resonance, they just simply read the labels. And when people make decisions just by reading the labels, and this one is good and that one is bad, well, obviously, their decision making is very regimented and limited. And so they don't account for the flow of changes. And that's the most constant thing in the universe. So they basically are not in the flow with the whole universe. And what we learn is how to be in the flow with the whole universe, or the Tao, if you will. We learn how to feel the energy resonance and use that in place of, or instead of, the decision-making mechanism based on reading labels such as good and bad. We literally apply this to everything. For example, when I go to, like this morning, I went to a bakery and I was checking which bread I wanted to buy. Well, I didn't just read the labels and figure, okay, well, this is bread that I'm supposed to buy, so this is going to be what I want. I actually checked for energy resonance with different types of bread and found the one that I resonated the most with.
Mm.
That is what I consider a much more intelligent way to make decisions. Because if you eat what you resonate with, you're going to benefit a lot better than eating something that you just considered good.
Yeah.
Because what's good for one person may not be good for another person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly why this also creates all the conflict in the world. It's because one person thinks that everyone should be following their idea of goodness. And of course, other people think that, no, we know better. This is good, not that. And so nobody can agree upon what is good or what's bad. And so they're fighting each other. And similarly, also, we talked about how everything is subject to the flow of changes. So what was good yesterday may not be good today, or certainly is going to change tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't account for that, we cannot be in the flow of changes.
Mm-hmm.
We have to pay attention to how things change, and it's not just black and white. It's not just polarized, good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole range of options that opens up to us when we start basing our decision making on the principle of energy resonance instead of preconceived ideas of right and wrong or good and bad.
Yes. Yes. And you actually answered my next question with that question. So, yes, that was actually what quality that the Qi Dao can strengthen or help people's daily life and dreams. And I think that's really is within this to be able to handle changes with more ease, or also to understand, to be aware of one's own resonance, not just going for a certain kind of idea that you have done the 7 or 6 years before, but you actually are using your own resonance in different situations, and what you resonate with today is maybe not what you resonate with, for example, in terms of food, with tomorrow, or what your body needs tomorrow, or the day after that.
Exactly.
So I think.
Well, in terms of what is it that we help people achieve through our practice, I would simply say we help them achieve greater health and happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, we help create heaven on earth. Sounds like a really bizarre idea. How can you create heaven on earth? Well, we basically learn how to live in paradise. What's paradise? And now we're making reference to Judeo-Christian religion. The Old Testament and the Bible talks about Adam and Eve who lived in paradise. And they lived in harmony with each other. They were naked and they never felt ashamed of their bodies. They felt and were in harmony with the world around them and also with the powers that be.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, they lost that harmony. How did they lose the harmony? By eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge. The knowledge of what? The knowledge of good and evil. That's exactly what happened. At a certain point in human history, there was a switch in consciousness. I actually attribute it to a very specific spiritual tradition or religion called Zoroastrianism that developed in Persia quite a number of years ago, probably close to 5,000 years ago, that influenced pretty much all organized religions ever since. The Zoroastrianism was also very much based on mythology of Persian people. And one of the myths was about basically the perennial struggle between the forces of good and evil.
Mm.
Well, they've been struggling ever since, and humanity has been suffering
Mm-hmm.
from incorporating this idea into their culture, into their language, into their way of thinking. Basically, humankind could no longer live in paradise.
Mm.
Adam and Eve got kicked out of paradise as soon as they started separating things into good and bad. And they could no longer live in harmony with each other, so they start feeling ashamed and covering themselves up. They start feeling discontent or discomfort in the world they lived in, so they could no longer live in harmony. They could no longer be in harmony with the powers that be that got basically kicked out of paradise. What we're learning is how to restore this sense of harmony. If we understand how we lost the sense of harmony as humans, then we can do something about it. If we lost the sense of harmony, if we lost paradise as a result of developing this dualistic way of thinking, dividing everything in good and bad, well, obviously, if we keep doing that, expecting any different results would be insanity. So we've got to change that. And we don't just get rid of this way of thinking, we need to replace it, because people, by and large, are so used to using this whole idea of good and bad, they wouldn't even know how else to make decisions.
Mm.
Luckily enough, we have a brilliant decision-making method based on energy resonance that allows you to make much more intelligent decisions, much more authentic decisions, that also you don't have to impose on other people and tell them, this is the right way to go, you should do what I do. No, we encourage them to make their own authentic decisions and empower them to be responsible for their decisions.
Yes.
So that is a really different way to be, but that is what allows us to experience paradise or heaven on earth.
Yes.
We'll really achieve what religions have been trying to achieve. And as long as they believe in the perennial struggle between forces of good and evil, there is never going to be any peace.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is this internal struggle in their belief system. And
Yeah.
if good could potentially prevail over evil, it would have done it a long time ago. But it never happened. That means that it's a perennial struggle that is never going to end. We just simply have to change our mentality. And as we let go of this belief and develop a different way of thinking, we develop a new way of being.
Specific this with resonance, and also be able to have a clear sense of what you resonate with. I think that has really been a journey for me, and I really like the way Qi Dao integrate or to use the body actually to create coherence in the system. Because, for example, for me, I have really, when working with the system, and again, there's difference between harmonious movements, the quality of how you create coherence in your system, that actually make resources accessible that I had forgotten, or maybe I had been in touch with when I was a child, but have totally forgotten these resources. But these resources have somehow become available when I start to create this coherence in my own system. So that has really been interesting for me to explore. Maybe you would tell a little more about that.
Absolutely. I really like how you brought up exploration, because that's exactly what we do. The practice of Qi Dao is not about memorizing and repeating certain moves, but rather exploring. Of course, there are principles that we want to learn, but we also learn them through testing. How do we test things? As you mentioned, we use our physical bodies. as the gauge, allowing us to gauge or assess how much resonance we experience.
Mm.
And as we realize that energy resonance is on a wide scale, so then we develop discernment based on recognition how much we resonate with certain things,
Mm-hmm.
at least at this particular moment in time. And the way we know that we resonate with something is by checking how the body responds or reacts to focusing our attention on that which we're checking or testing.
Mm.
For example, if I test my own stability or balance, well, I will ask somebody, do me a favor and try to push me. There is a special technique for testing push. It's a very specific type of push where you use only gravity to produce energy instead of physical force, because physical force is very subjective. One time you push harder, another time you push lighter, versus gravity, which is a consistent force that pulls you in a very specific direction all the time at the same rate. And we use gravity to test the whole body.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of isolating a particular part of the body, like they do, for example, in muscle testing, we use the whole system.
Mm.
If the whole body is easily pushed over or easily off balance, well, obviously there is some room for improvement in how I balance myself. So we learn how to develop greater balance in the body, how to develop greater alignment, how to develop, understand the principle of grounding, the principle of rooting, and all kinds of other principles that we study. But then we can also learn how to test ourselves without somebody pushing us. That requires a little bit more self-awareness than what most people have. But as we develop greater self-awareness, we can actually test how well we resonate with something even without being pushed.
Mm.
What do we do? Well, one of the ways to do it is just to check our physiological process called breathing. We all breathe all the time, most of the time at least. And the way that we breathe reveals how well we resonate with something. Simply, if you don't resonate with something or someone, for example, if you listen to music that you can't stand, your breathing will be affected.
Mm-hmm. That's fine.
Will become faster,
yeah.
more shallow, or more stressed. If you listen to music that you love listening to, that you can listen to for hours,
Relaxed, yes.
become more relaxed. You don't experience any stress. So we realize that the stress is basically how the central nervous system reacts to things that we don't resonate with.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gives us the ability to gauge our degree of resonance by observing our own breathing. Now, of course, breathing is one of those physiological functions that can be changed consciously. So a lot of Qigong teachers and teachers of many other disciplines, yoga, meditation, you name it, they teach breathing techniques, how to breathe right.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of that, what we learn is how to use our breathing as the gauge. When we observe how we breathe, we notice that under some circumstances, depending on what we focus our attention on, we experience deeper and smoother breathing. We become more natural when it comes to a breath. And other circumstances cause us to become more stressed, and our breathing becomes more stifled or rapid.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we start using our own physiology as the gauging tool. And that also gives us the ability to use it pretty much anywhere. Wherever you go, you can sense how well you breathe.
Mm-hmm.
But even more importantly, we learn how to sense the whole body. Not only the breathing muscles, such as diaphragm and intercostals and other muscles that are involved in breathing, get affected, when we become stressed. The whole body develops certain pattern of tension depending on particular state of consciousness the central nervous system gets into. It will affect your body in a particular way. And so we've also learned about different states of consciousness and how that affects our physiology and physical stature. And we learn how to understand that these are not bad things that happen to us. Under some circumstances, that actually is warranted and necessary to get into a particular state of consciousness or tap into particular energy resources within ourselves that would enable us to deal with those types of circumstances. But unfortunately, most people get stuck in those habituated states of consciousness, holding themselves in habitual ways, and develop chronic holding patterns, which of course wreak havoc in their health because holding tension leads to energy blockages, which of course affects our health negatively. So we learn how to basically address the root causes of ill health and learn how to not just heal ourselves, but also prevent a lot of health problems that a lot of people suffer from in our modern lifestyle.
Yeah. Yes. How to use this really ancient knowledge in today modern society. I think most of these really ancient system actually has a lot of history. So for not repeating ourselves, forgetting what we have discovered, I think there's a lot of knowledge in these ancient systems that actually could help us today with this really in-deep knowledge about inner system as well as the world or the nature in general. I would actually like to ask you about, as a Qigong master, you are both a really great teacher and fantastic healer, and have done a lot of things. How have you gone from, for example, teaching, healing, therapy,
Applications?
Yes, difference, and then you have like created coaching. How did it go? I would like to hear something about your story.
My initial interest was very much in the realm of martial arts because I wanted to learn how to kick ass like my grandpa. And I was a rambunctious kid who was always getting top grades at school in all subjects except behavior. At least in the Soviet Union, the behavior of the student also was graded, and I was always getting bad marks for my behavior, even though all the subjects that I was studying, all the sciences and arts, I was getting top grades. Why was I misbehaving? Maybe because I had so much energy that I just couldn't sit still, and I wanted to engage in some explorations. I don't think I had ADHD, as the children are often diagnosed nowadays, but I was really curious about everything. And so as I was studying martial arts, I was also curious, for example, well, how can I heal myself if I get bruised or hurt? Well, that was obviously my introduction to the healing aspects of Qi Dao. But when I was like 6 years old, I also frustrated my parents by peeing in bed at night. And they were stressed out about that. You know, what are we going to do with this kid that's supposed to get up in the middle of the night and use the bathroom if he needs to pee? And they apparently asked my grandfather what to do with me. And he said, oh, let me talk to him. And what he asked me was what I dream about on those occasions when I would pee in bed. And I told him that I was dreaming about going to the bathroom. So that was pretty natural for me to relieve myself, except I was actually wetting my bed. And he was like, that's great. So what if you realize that you're dreaming? Would you pee in bed then? I was like, no, of course not. Who wants to sleep in the wet bed? He's like, okay, well, what if you learn how to realize that you're dreaming if you're about to use the bathroom in your dream? I said, well, how am I supposed to do that? And he goes, tell yourself that you're dreaming every time you use the bathroom.
Mm.
And so by me developing the habit of telling myself that I am dreaming when I'm using the bathroom, I actually also started doing the same thing in my night dreams, which almost immediately prevented any sleeping in a wet bed anymore.
Mm.
Like the same as a wet dream, which obviously happens mostly to teenagers when they have an ejaculation in the middle of the night. Well, that certainly was another good inspiration for me. I simply realized, okay, so what am I dreaming about when I have a wet dream? So again, obviously I was dreaming about having sex or having some exciting, arousing experiences. So I actually learned how to tell myself that I'm dreaming while having sex or while having any kind of exciting encounters with the opposite sex. By developing that skill, I also obviously got introduced to a very important aspect of Tantra. And that obviously gave me an inspiration to dive deeper into the study of Tantric arts and Tantric Qigong. One of the branches that is particularly little known in the West. People sometimes hear a little bit about some kind of sexual energetics involved in Qigong, usually mostly from the fellow Qigong master named Mantak Chia. And guess what? That's because he lives in Thailand, a part of the world called Indochina. And I was just mentioning how Indochina, just like Tibet, received influences from both China and India, hence the name. And one of the influences from the Indian culture was Tantra. And so that's why both in Thailand and in Tibet, tantric practices became more integrated with energy arts as compared to what's happening in mainland China. Now, what happened for me personally is I also at some point developed a clinic called Portland Qigong Clinic. Portland is the city where I lived, and so I created a Qigong clinic. At that time, it was one of 5 or maybe 6 Qigong clinics in the United States. And I was relatively successful. But when I got married, my wife, now ex-wife, got a job to be Assistant Attorney General of the island of Guam. Guam is a U.S. territory in the Pacific, a small tropical island, and apparently they also have an Attorney General on that island, and the Attorney General needed some assistance, and so she got a job as an Assistant Attorney General, even before she ever set her foot on that island. And I was like, okay, well, I guess we're going to move to Guam. And so I literally moved 7,000 miles away from all my clients and students who were still on the mainland United States. I had to figure out how to continue doing my work. Luckily enough, at that time, Skype came online and basically became possible to communicate using video chat. Of course, the quality of the video was really poor back then, but better than nothing. And I figured out how to basically combine the modern methodologies of coaching with the ancient energy arts of Qigong. Developed the Qigong coaching profession. Another reason why I developed Qigong coaching is because in my work at the clinic, I had a very high success rate, close to 95%. A lot of people were experiencing massive breakthroughs and experienced healing during the sessions. And then they went home. And the following week or two, I would see them again, and I would observe how they backslid.
Mm.
Maybe not all the way to where they had been, but at least there was certain lack of progress. And I would ask them whether they did any homework that I prescribed to them, whether they did any of those meditation practices that I gave them, or whether they practiced any body alignment awareness, or integrated any of the principles that I introduced to them in their daily lives. And most of them said no. Whether they forgot it or got distracted by a million things that people do in their lives, or just they didn't have that on top of their mind, and so they didn't do the homework.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started looking into the reasons why people didn't do the homework, because I knew that people heal when and to the degree that they're ready to heal. So I started looking for basically a way to facilitate their readiness to heal. And I couldn't find any modality of healing that would facilitate one's readiness to heal.
Mm-hmm.
Except there was one thing that I became aware of, and at that time it was not the fastest growing profession in the world yet, but it is now, especially thanks to the pandemic, and that's coaching.
Mm.
The difference between coaching and therapy, or any type of healing, is that the healer, by and large, assumes that he or she knows better than their client or patient what is right for them. And so they are going to do some therapeutic intervention, or they do some healing session on them. And the client or a patient is basically more or less a passive recipient of what is being given to them or done to them. Especially in energy healing modalities like Reiki or various other energy healing techniques, where basically the client is passive, just lying or standing or sitting and receiving energy applied to them. Mm-hmm. And what I realized is that they actually need to be fully involved. And the more the person is involved in self-healing, the better they heal. Mm-hmm. The more they're ready to heal, of course, the more they will experience benefits of healing. And so I actually found that coaching was different from therapy, and also was different from teaching, because it's not based on assumption that the coach knows what's right for the client. The coach doesn't even try to teach the client what is they're supposed to learn. Instead, they're inviting them to learn something from their experiences, maybe instigating, maybe prodding them a little bit with some questions, providing some motivation, and very importantly, providing accountability. Over time, accountability obviously leads to much greater success. And also, the coach encourages the coaching client to apply what they're learning, not just once during the session, but throughout their daily life on a regular basis. And so that is something that was unique and different, that was never done, at least to my knowledge, in energy arts or Qigong. So I basically ended up creating this new profession of Qigong coaching that also started practicing with the people living all over the world, which of course opened up opportunities to work with people not just on the little island that I ended up living on, but really little. It's like 8 miles wide by 22 miles long. It's pretty little. And instead, I actually started working with people all over the world. I have students and coaching clients on all continents. And that's something that I now also teach other people how to do so that they can become Qigong coaches. So that my work is also leveraged. I just change one person's quality of life at a time. I work with a person who starts coaching others. And that essentially multiplies my effort, and I find that much more rewarding for me. I still work with a few select coaching clients, either the ones who have unique issues that the other coaches that I trained are not prepared to deal with. And also, of course, I charge a lot more money for what I do. So those people who can afford working with me, obviously they work with me, and others work with my students, other Qigong coaches. And every certified Qigong coach practicing worldwide went through my training program because it's the only program in the world certifying people as Qigong coaches.
Mhm. Yes, well, I would definitely say the first time I tried Qigong coaching really blew me away. It was really, really helpful. What would you say is the core value or the core of Qigong coaching? Um,
Well, obviously, different people have different values,
mhm.
and Qigong coaching can be used to help them satisfy whatever values they have. So, if, for example, a person's values are more oriented towards family, of course, we can help that person experience happiness in their family life, a greater harmony within their family, strengthen their health and the health of the family members. If the person, for example, is concerned with or focused on their finances, yeah, we can coach them how to improve their financial health or experience greater cash flow or financial flow. Obviously, money is currency, so it flows. And what we do is we basically coach them in that case how to position themselves right, how to offer to other people what they really value in such a way that they would be paid money for it. We also can work with a variety of other people. For example, I've worked with many athletes, whether they're martial artists or gymnasts or ice skaters or fencers or any other athletes, because peak performance is something that athletes often experience as a result of being in the zone.
Mm.
Being in the zone is the same thing as being in the flow in our vernacular. In other words, in order to experience peak performance, you need to be in the flow of things, in the flow of your life, in the flow of energy that everything is made of in life.
Mm-hmm.
So we may not recognize that everything is energy.
Mm.
Anyone who graduated from high school probably, at least theoretically, knows that everything is energy. We learn how to recognize it not just theoretically, but through our practice. And when we have a practical recognition that everything is energy, we can actually experience much greater state of flow. As I said, it's a holy grail of most Qigong practitioners, but also something that boosts performance in sports or in martial arts or in many other endeavors. For example, I work with some performing artists and singers and actors. Obviously, if you're an actor, it's really helpful to be in the flow so that you can perform at peak.
Mm-hmm.
Very helpful to know about holding patterns because you can portray your character much more authentically, demonstrating their state of consciousness through the way that your body changes the way it holds itself. In other words, actors become much better actors, athletes become much better athletes, entrepreneurs become much better business people, healers become greater healers.
Yeah.
Lovers become greater lovers. Parents become better parents. Basically, it can be applied to a variety of aspects of life.
Mm-hmm.
But what I personally focus the most on are the people who are interested in enlightenment or experiencing of what we would call spiritual awakening. Now, if you're familiar with the pyramid of needs designed by Abraham Maslow, the foundation of the pyramid consists of the relatively basic needs of shelter, food, water, clean air to breathe. And then higher rungs of the pyramid also include things like safety and relationships and recognition. And eventually, the person's interests reach a level of personal development and eventually self-actualization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's what I'm personally most interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Self-actualization or self-realization, and how to apply all our practices in order to achieve that. In order to experience self-realization, of course, we need to take care of the lower rungs of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people I work with personally are the ones who are already relatively high on this pyramid of Maslow.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, their foundational needs are taken care of, more or less. Their family needs are taken care of, more or less. They feel like they're not struggling with the basics of life.
Mm-hmm.
Now they can pursue mastery. Now they can pursue self-realization. That's obviously my personal predilection. Other coaches who I teach also have their own areas of interest or specialization. Some people specialize in helping people relieve tensions and reduce pain. Some people specialize in peak performance. Some specialize in other aspects. In other words, if you ask me, that's my personal predilection, to focus more specifically on personal development and self-actualization.
As you said, as the pyramid of Maslow, there is different needs, and I also think there's different dreams within our nature. I think specifically it's really interesting to dive deep into our nature to really find the resonance in depths, also not just on the surface, but then in depths. That's quite a journey, like a really interesting discovery, and I think everyone would benefit in knowing about more self-knowledge and what they really resonate with. As I also have discovered, it really creates more grace and happiness in life. So
yeah, that's what we want, and most people seem to want more happiness, and they can benefit from more harmony and grace.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I really like that you brought up dreams, because in a big scheme of things, we realize that we're not only learning how to awaken in our night dreams, like I just mentioned, the story of how I was learning how to be more awake in my dreams at night, which was my introduction to Buddhist Qigong, which is also directly associated with the other Tibetan practice called Dream Yoga. But it also gives us an ability to recognize how in our daily lives, we also experience dreamlike experiences all the time. I mean, every thought that we have, whether it's a thought about the past or a thought about the future, by definition is a daydream. So learn how to be awake in our daydreams by reminding ourselves that our thoughts are dreams, and they're also made of energy, the energy of consciousness. And we can feel the flow of energy and learn how to be in the flow in our thoughts, which obviously provides us the ability to enjoy a greater inner peace, greater creativity, tap into some resources that enable us to be wiser or somehow else more conscious, and also gives us the ability eventually to translate this awakening also into the whole big dream we call daily life. Well, that spiritual awakening is also what we refer to as enlightenment. So we learn how to live an enlightened life. And we realize that enlightenment is not like a big destination somewhere at the end of a long journey. It's a process of becoming more and more enlightened, more and more awake. We learn that we are not on a journey to enlightenment, we are on a journey of enlightenment. As we integrate the idea of awakening into our daily lives, we actually start experiencing our lives being more like a dream. Well, who wouldn't want to live a dream life? That's what most people only wish for or dream of to manifest their dreams. Well, what we realize is that we are living a dream life already. We're just not awake to its true nature. And as we become more and more awake, we realize that, well, this is a dream life. I am actually living in my dream. Now, if I am conscious in this dream, can I experience even more harmony and happiness in it? If you're conscious in your dream at night, well, it's much less likely you're going to turn it into a nightmare. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people live their daily lives like a nightmare. And that's one of the reasons why they would be motivated to learn how to be awake in their daily lives, so that instead of a nightmare, they experience much happier dream life. That also obviously would be a more awake life, more enlightened way of living. So essentially, I don't just teach Qi Dao as another Qigong style. I teach it as a Qigong lifestyle, an awakened lifestyle, focusing on self-mastery, ability to be in the flow, and live the life of your dreams.
Yes.
Who wouldn't want that, right?
Yes. Thank you very much for answering all of my questions. I really was delighted that you to tell me the story of Qi Dao.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking great questions.